Okay, so thank you very much everyone for joining us today for this innovation workshop organized by DLRC on artificial intelligence in medicine. Artificial hope or intelligent solutions are obviously a very hot topic for the industry, and I'm really looking forward to hearing on the concrete actions that should be taken on that and how to address that important topic on a regulatory angle. So just a little bit of housekeeping for how a workshop works. You have two presenters today. They will go through the slides, but obviously we'd like you to contribute if you want to. And so to enable you to ask questions or post any comment you may have. But in order to do so, if you can use the chat box, that would be great. And so to just remain muted and camera off during the time of presentation, and then we'll open a bit further at the end if you would like to. The session is recorded, as you probably heard from the voice at the beginning, so then you can always get back to it or share with colleagues later on when that's available on the Genesis app. So that's it for me. I will pass the Zoom microphone to Tia Morgan, who will start the presentation and run through some really good insights on AI in medicine. Thanks.
Thank you. So hi everyone, welcome to our workshop on AI in medicine. Is this artificial hope or intelligent solutions? So I'm Thea Morgan and I'm here with my colleague Indraj. We're both from DLRC, which is a regulatory consulting business. So I'll be presenting the first half of this workshop about the new clinical trial regulation and how AI can help increase efficiencies with the short timeframes that this new regulation has implemented and is like a big initiative. So as I said, I'm presenting with my colleague Indraj, who'll talk in the second half about the new medical devices regulations and how AI can be applied to healthcare. So just to say, I am filling in for my colleague James today, who's unfortunately fallen ill and is unable to attend. But I do work on CTR with him at DLRC. I'm just a little bit less experienced. So any questions, I'm happy to give it my best go. But if I need to go back and look something up and then get back to you on it, then I'm more than happy to do so, but I might have to do that. So we're going to start out with a quick poll, just to sort of understand the audience and just how familiar everyone is with AI. So we've got 4 options. Firstly, who is Al? Just as a bit of a joke. And then we have, I use Siri, Alexa, or Google Assistant on a daily basis, or like you know who they are. You can't wait for all cars to be self-driving, or finally just you're excited to see what AI can do.
I think it's a consensus, so I will stop it here.
Yep, so everyone's replied with they're excited to see what AI can do. So that's good to see that everyone's interested. And I would put myself in that bracket as well. So going on to just a little bit about what we're going to be talking about. So as I said, I'll be doing the first half. So just doing a quick introduction to the EU clinical trial regulation, and then just another quick introduction into what is artificial intelligence, and then merging the two about how AI can increase efficiencies to do with CTR. And then Indraj will take over and she'll talk about how AI can increase efficiencies in these 2 new medical devices regulations. And then also how AI can be applied in a healthcare situation. And then finally, just a case study on the medical device software using AI. So what is CTR? So CTR is the new clinical trial regulation, and it's the new guideline for clinical trials in the EU, taking over from the directive, the CTD, and also the national legislation that was put in place to implement the directive called the VHP, the Voluntary Harmonization Procedure. And then coupled with CTR is the new database for submission of clinical trial applications, CTIS, so the Clinical Trial Information System. This is where all documents minus SUSARs, so SUSARs are part of CTR, but they're just not submitted to the information system. But all the rest of the documents are submitted to there, and all communications as well are heard from both the health authorities and the regulatory authorities together all in one place. That's what CTR is. And so we have some changes that CTR is bringing compared to the directive. So we have 6 of them. This is transition, submission strategy, timelines brought about by CTR, the user management within CTIS, transparency, which is a big new initiative, and EU operations. So starting with transition, we have 3 timelines to go. So the first one, which is becoming scarily soon, is on the 31st of January 2022, so in about 2 months' time, is the CTR go live date. So this means that clinical trial applications can be submitted either under the CTR or under the CTD. So this is a good period to sort of test out the CTR, maybe put an application into it. And if you realise, actually, I don't have the resources or the facilities to be able to work under the CTR right now, then you can always withdraw your application and submit it under the CTD, because the CTD is still open. So this is sort of an either or period of time. So then a year later, we have the 31st of January 2023, and this is where new clinical trial applications, their submissions have to be under the regulation. So this also includes if you want to add an additional member state to your trials. So your trial will have to be transitioned to CTR, so then you can also add your member state. So this is happening for 2 years until the 31st of January 2025, where the directive is being revoked and all trials have to be transitioned to the CTR. So again, that's happening in around 3 years. There we go. So next we have submission strategy. So applications can either be submitted as part 1, which is trial-specific data, including things like your protocol or your IB or your IMPD, and then other things along with that. And then you have, you could also submit your part 1 and also some part 2s. So part 2 is your national specific data, including site and investigator suitability, or your informed consent, or things like that. So you can submit some part 2s, so the trial can start once those part 2s are approved in those member states, but you can add additional member states later on if you'd like. And so then the last option is submitting both part 1 and all of your part 2s, so your trial can start immediately in all your member states. So that's submission strategy. So next we go on to these new timelines that the CTR have instated. So For initial application, this is assessed by your reference member state and your other member states, assessed within 60 days. And this is a very strict timeline. So if they don't come to an agreement in 60 days, then your trial will be tacit approved. So you will have an approved trial after, well, you will have a decision on your trial after 60 days, no matter what, essentially. So next we have substantial modifications, which are the new substantial amendments. It's the same thing, just different name. So these are assessed in 49 days, and that's not including request for information, which is the next timeline, which the sponsor has to apply for and give this information within either 10 or 12 days, depending on what part of the application it is, or part of the assessment it is. So we have either validation or assessment phases that you can be asked for information about. So validation is just making sure you have all your documents submitted, and then assessment is questions about the documents that you've submitted. And then the total time for RFIs, again, depending on if it's in a validation or assessment phases, is either 15 or 31 days. That's the timelines that they're starting CTR. So next we have the user management within CTIS. So again, this is all new things. So you have to be assigned roles to access CTIS and to be able to work on your clinical trial application. So these can be assigned by the admin roles. So they can assign and revoke roles, and for the main application, there are two types of admins. There's a sponsor admin and a clinical trial admin. And sponsor admin can just do the assigning and revoking roles, but the clinical trial admin can also do the business roles as well as the admin roles. So it's sort of like a master person, essentially. So the business roles, you can have preparer, viewer, or submitter roles for your application, or for your notifications, or for your safety results, or your clinical study report as a part of an MAA. So the business roles that can actually affect the application and do work on that. So you have to be assigned a role to be able to work on your application. So next we have transparency, which, as I mentioned, is a very big initiative that the regulation has started. And it's the main initiative that EMA is pushing for. So it's good for patients to be able to see their trial, and good for big data analysis as well for people like academics who want to understand what's going on in their industry. And this also avoids unnecessary duplication of trials and duplication of unsuccessful trials as well. So this means that all documents apart from the QIMPD, financial arrangements and safety reporting will be made public in some way. But this can be, your confidential information essentially can be redacted in some places, and also your ability to make your documents public can be deferred, and it can be deferred for a significant amount of time, such as up to 7 years after end of trial. So that is quite a long time, and that's for things like protocol, IB, and your informed consent form. And then finally, we have EU operations. So one application is submitted to CTIS for both regulatory and ethics approval. So this is different than the current CTD that has two separate applications. And then your reference member state will be responsible for application approvals and RFIs, and they have input from the member states. And this can be both from a regulation side or an ethics side. The ethics side are mainly for the Part 2s, which is the national specific documents. So that is a very quick talk about the key changes under the CTR, so you sort of know what's going on. So now to include AI. So what is artificial intelligence? So the general definition is it's the capability of machines to perform intelligent tasks. So it's essentially the simulation of intelligent behaviors designed to be performed in humans, but it's actually completed by computers. So then here we have some examples. So machine learning, logic and knowledge-based approaches, statistical approaches. Yes, so that is some examples. So now how AI could potentially be applied in CTR. So here I've gone into a little bit more detail about 3 different types of technologies. The first is natural language processing. So this is a branch of artificial intelligence concerned with giving computers the ability to understand text and spoken word in the same way as humans can. So this drives computer programs that can translate text from one language to the other. And another example are smart devices, as they listen to what you say and then they process it accordingly and can give an output. So then next we have the natural language generation. This is a subcategory of natural language processing. It automatically transforms structured data into human readable text. So this could be a big group of data that you have and you just want to create a summary from it, or it could be generating text that is written really technically and turning it into more of a layperson's document. So finally, we have robotic process automation. This uses automation to mimic back office tasks of human workers, such as extracting data, filling in forms, moving files, that sort of thing. This isn't technically an AI, as robotic process automation is process driven rather than AI data driven that AIs are. So RPA can follow a process that's been coded for by a human, whereas AI can learn from the data and recognize patterns in that data. But they both complement each other, so I thought it was relevant to mention. So how can these technologies be used to help CTR? So firstly, natural language processing. It can be used for translation of documents, and then this could be used instead of, if it's very accurate, or more likely in addition to outsourcing like human translators to just review the work of the AI to make sure that it's accurate. And in CTR, this could be really helpful with tight deadlines for, as I mentioned before, requests for information, which have like a 12-day deadline, or substantial modifications if you have to translate something. So that could be really helpful. So as it's computers understanding language in the same way as humans, that's essentially translation. So that's why it'd be natural language processing. So natural language generation could help. We have new documents under the clinical trial regulation called the layperson summary of results, and also the protocol synopsis, which is written in layperson's terms. So this could be really helpful to have the just the summary of results and generate that layperson's new formatting or just the language that it's written in. So that AI could really help with that, or have the protocol and it just be able to create a summary, so the synopsis, which is written in layperson's terms. And then it can also convert raw data results into these summary of results that we have under the CTR. So for all of our results submissions, they're summaries. So this would help if you have your raw results from your trial. So finally, we have robotic process automation. This is more hypothetical because it would be used like within CTIS. So this is where you could submit a document and it would be automatically, your data in this document would be automatically entered into the data fields within CTIS. So this would be efficient in submissions with lots of different data fields, like our event reporting for things like serious breaches, urgent safety measures, things like that. And it would also be really helpful if you're using CROs, because if CROs have access to CTIS, then they can see all the, well, depending obviously on what role they have, they can see quite a lot of data about your trial. So if you didn't want your CROs to have access to that, they could create these documents and make sure you just have headers where all the data fields could be. And they would, so the robotic process automation would be able to take those headers and the information underneath it and just put it into each data field. So that would be really helpful to increase privacy essentially from CROs, and it could also just increase efficiency when you're in CTIS. So now I have a little case study just to do CTR, but also to do with AI. So I'll just read it out. Company A had a serious breach in their trial that they've submitted under the CTR. They need to submit notifications to tell the regulatory authorities of their breach and what they've done about it. This means that they have to submit unexpected event, serious breach, urgent safety measures, and temporary halt notifications. And each of these submissions have many data fields. Each of these submissions either have a 7-day or 15-day timeline to submit CTIS from the time the sponsor was aware. And if the sponsor doesn't do this, there could be consequences such as fines. So reports need to be created, once again, for all of these submissions, and they'll need to be redacted, both personal protected data and commercially confidential data, so they don't make public information that they shouldn't, essentially. A summary report also needs to be created for the serious breach notification, and all of this for serious breach needs to be created within 7 days. So this is obviously a very quick timeline. So could AI be helpful in this situation? I think it could. So again, we have a quick poll just to ask what technologies could be used, what technologies that I've just talked about could be used to help client A. And also there could be more than one answer to this.
Giving 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'm ending it.
Great, thank you. So we've had a good range of answers, and So we've got mainly natural language processing, but also generation and robotic process automation. So personally, I would say that you need natural language generation, as summaries need to be made for your serious breach. So that could be really helpful to create those summaries. And then also robotic process automation, as there are many data fields that need to be filled out for these event notifications. So it could be helpful to reduce time filling out. I wouldn't, from the examples that I gave, I wouldn't necessarily say natural language processing, but this could, it is technically correct because natural language generation is a subcategory of natural language processing. But the example that I used for natural language processing was translation, and these documents shouldn't need to be translated into any other languages. So yes, that is all from me. I will now pass over to Indraj to talk about medical devices.
Thank you, Thea. So just a quick introduction to myself. I'm Indraj Bamra. I'm a principal regulatory consultant here at DLRC. I work on medical devices, and I've had around 11 years experience in the medical device industry, predominantly in regulatory affairs and quality management systems, having worked with the MHRA in industry and in consulting for the last 6 years. So I'm just going to give a quick introduction to what the MDR and IVDR is. Hopefully you have an idea if you're interested in medical devices. So the Medical Devices Regulation and the In Vitro Diagnostic Medical Devices Regulation are new regulations which are intended by the European Commission to standardize the regulatory framework for medical devices and IVDs across Europe. They introduce more stringent clinical requirements to ensure that devices are safer and perform more effectively. And they also get rid of the directives which are subject to national adoption by each member state. So hopefully the MDR and IVDR would standardize the whole regulation across Europe. Now, the MDR date of application was the 26th of May this year, and the IVDR date of application is the 26th of May 2022. So this is just a bit of background because I'm predominantly going to be focusing on the MDR. And the reason for this is I'm not specifically looking at the UK GB regulations because it may be that those are going to align a lot more with the MDR, which seems to be the way it is going at the moment. Thanks, Thea. Next slide, please. It's just following on from the technology that Thea was talking about, which can be used in increasing efficiencies in CTR. We can still see with these technologies that you can also incorporate them into your MDR and IVDR processes. So these can be used for documentation. They can also be used in reporting requirements. So for example, natural language processing can be used for translation of device labeling and your IFUs. And this is extremely important when you're selling your devices in a number of European countries where you need to be providing your labeling in the member states' national languages. Using natural language generation, again, with the MDR and IVDR, you are required to provide summaries of safety and clinical performance. And also if you're doing clinical investigation summaries, and these are to be shared on UDAMED and made publicly available. So therefore you can use natural language generation to generate these summaries. It can also be used for document creation. As we know, there's several documents you need to create for your technical documentation file. So it may be able to take complex information and try to summarize it or provide, good, just generally create tables and explain the information that you're putting into your documents. Robotic process automation can also be used where you, again, are producing lots of documents for your technical documentation file and you have common sections. So this would ensure consistency. So for example, where you're having to repeater indications for use, your intended use, the warnings. Using robotic process automation can just duplicate this information and ensure consistency across your documents. In addition, you can use it for vigilance reporting, again, where you are kind of following a yes/no workflow to determine whether it needs to be reported and the timelines within which it needs to be reported. So this is where we can see AI being included in your processes for implementing MDR and IVDR and also running efficiently. This slide is starting to now talk about how AI is being integrated into healthcare and specifically medical devices. So in the first line here, I have identified technology where AI is either integrated or we are using a lot of AI for these investigations to provide diagnosis and detect diseases. In the next line, it shows what the benefits of using such technology is to the healthcare industry. And in the third line, which you can see for yourself, is the real world outcomes or the advantages of using AI in healthcare, which again, shows that it can be more accurate, can be faster and provide earlier disease detection, can be used in public health screening, and will also overall optimize treatment if it's done correctly. Next slide, please. So just to put the MDR regulations into context, I'm presenting a case study here that we will use to just discuss the next points. So in our case study, a company is developing a medical device software application. Now, this medical device software application takes medical images, medical images, so from a CT scan or an X-ray scan, and it identifies and tags areas of interest. So it processes the image and then localizes specific areas of interest and marks them or tags them so that a clinician, when reviewing these images, then pays attention to those specific areas. And the software doesn't identify what these areas of interest, what condition they may be, or classifies a condition. It just merely shows that this is kind of a bit abnormal, therefore a clinician needs to review this as a priority. So you would need clinician input for further evaluation and to provide the diagnosis. So the technology is based on image processing, and it uses machine learning to aid in detection and localization of abnormalities. Just a quick definition of what machine learning or deep learning is. So deep learning is a subset of machine learning, and it's based on artificial neural networks. It enables the development of applications which have demonstrated performance levels that are approaching those of trained professionals in tasks such as interpretation of medical images. Next slide, please. So when we start applying the MDR to this device, the first few things we need to start to consider are the device classification. Depending on your device classification, that would also drive your conformity assessment route. So class 1 devices, so as we know, under the MDR, devices are classified from 1 to 3, with 1 being the lowest risk and 3 being the highest risk. Therefore, class 1 devices generally are self-certified. Anything above class 1 will need notified body involvement. And also, as you get higher up the risk class, the level of detail that the notified body will be looking at in your QMS and your technical documentation also increases. The other consideration we need to think about is whether any component that we're using in our software is outsourced versus internally developed. We need to think about clinical data requirements, the validation plans, and how we're going to validate the product, compatibility and interoperability of the device as well. And then another thing that I will touch on a bit later is other applicable regulations. And here I've used an example such as the proposed EU AI regulation. So looking at the medical device software classification, under the MDR, there are two categories of software, and these are software driving or influencing the use of a device and independent software. In our case, our device is an independent software product because it's not driving or influencing the use of the medical imaging device. So under the MDR classification rules, independent software is classed in its own right, and it's also classified as an active device. So rules 9 to 13 would apply. However, rule 11 is quite specific to medical device software, and you would also have to consider special rules 14 to 22. In this case, I have already ruled out rules 9, 10, 13, and the 14 to 22. So we only need to consider rule 11. So rule 11 basically covers any medical device software which provides information that is subsequently used for treatment purposes. And this places those types of devices into class 2A. So it's not the lowest risk, but it's not the highest risk. If any decisions made from this information has an impact that can cause death or an irreversible deterioration in a person's state of health, then it's in class 3. And similarly, if it only causes serious deterioration or needs surgical intervention, then it's a class 2B. The next two lines don't really apply to our device because our device is not intended to monitor physiological processes. However, the last line replaces all other medical device software into class 1. So based on this, I just wanted to run a poll to see how you would classify this product that we are talking about. And Aline, if you could run the poll, please.
Yes, sorry, I'm on it. There we go.
Thank you.
Just to say it's anonymous, so even if you give the wrong answer, we won't know. Okay, should I end it? Yeah.
Okay, that's great. So we've got a mixture of class 2A and class 2B. And I think if you answered anything between those two, you would be right, because I don't think we have enough information based on the medical device regulation rules to be able to classify that completely correctly. So in order to help us, the MDCG, which is the medicine, sorry, I can't remember the acronym again now. Never mind. The MDCG has provided guidance which is based on the IMDRF risk classification for medical device software, and this helps us just look at the classification again, and helps to see where the device would lie. So it's based on the significance of information that's provided by the software, and then it's compared to the state of healthcare or situation or the patient condition. So in this case, because our device is not really doing anything, but it's just identifying and localizing areas of interest, which then need to go to a clinician who will then make a decision on whether this patient has a specific condition, it's defined as informing clinical management. So you can see here that even for critical, serious, and non-serious situations, every time it'll be classed as a class 2A. Now, if our device was to do a little bit more, so for example, it was to say that based on an image that you were either had a condition or you didn't, so then it's potentially driving clinical management, and therefore then we would either classify the device as a 2A or 2B. But in our case, because it's only informing clinical management, it's class 2A. Next slide, please. So once you've decided your device classification, then you need to start to determine how you're going to show product performance. The first thing to look at is the valid clinical association. And this is where you need to determine whether the outputs of your software based on your inputs and the algorithms on which your device is based is providing information for your targeted clinical condition. In our case study, we would need to provide evidence that the condition of interest causes those specific abnormalities that are being localized in the images and tagged in the images. So this can be demonstrated by scientific literature, clinical research, or professional guidelines. The second thing you'd be looking at is analytical validation. And here you'd need to ensure that your software as a medical device meets the technical requirements. So you need to provide evidence to show that the output of your software is technically what is expected. So here you can use data that's been previously collected. So for example, retrospectively collected images to provide evidence that your software can identify and tag areas of interest that are associated with the disease of interest. The third product performance attribute that you need to consider is whether your device is generating clinically relevant outputs. So we need to ensure here that we can demonstrate that our software has been tested in our targeted populations, that the use is accurate, predictable, and reliable. Now, it doesn't stop there. Once you've completed your product performance, you need to continually collect and analyze data, because this data can be used to inform your future use of your software. Real-world performance data can then also start to inform your device functionality, the intended use, whether your device is being used off-label, or if there's additional indications that you can start to apply your device to. And this may evolve during your device development and while you are generating evidence. You could be using post-market surveillance data here. That can include safety data, performance study results, clinical evidence, any new research that's been conducted, and direct user feedback. This would then feed back into your clinical evaluation to determine whether your clinical benefits are still outweighing any clinical risks to the patient. Once you have any new clinical evidence, then you can then review your intended use and intended purpose of the device. And it may be that you're seeing that you can start to apply your software in new areas, which would then you'd have to redefine the intended use and perhaps your device classification, and it may also affect your conformity assessment. So in addition to this, you also need to think about applicable regulations. In our case, as it's a medical device, the MDR 2017-745 would apply. In addition to this, there is a new AI regulation that's been proposed, that the proposal has been accepted by the EC Commission, and it was released in April this year. It's a global effort to manage risks associated with any AI that would be providing any output in Europe. Before this can be adopted or applied, it's going to need to go through rigorous legislative processes. However, it's good to know that it may be coming, because failure to comply with the AI regulation may result in quite hefty fines. Now, this AI regulation classifies AI into 3 risk categories. You have the unacceptable risk category, which is products such as social scoring AI, and that will be completely prohibited from use in Europe. The high-risk AI systems include products that are providing information for critical infrastructure, such as transport, or even safety components of products, and medical devices are included in the high-risk AI system category. Then you have the lower risk, minimal risk systems, which have very few requirements that you need to comply with, but these include things like AI-enabled video games. Now, for the high-risk systems, these will be subject to the most level of requirements that you'd need to demonstrate. So these include things like human oversight, transparency, cybersecurity, risk management, data quality, monitoring, and reporting obligations. The good news is that the proposal says that if you have a notified body that is conformity assessing your medical device, they can do the same conformity assessment under the AI. So hopefully you would have all those points covered anyway for the medical device regulations. In addition to this, the US FDA, Health Canada, and the UK MHRA have jointly identified 10 guiding principles that can inform the development of good machine learning practice. And these guiding principles are intended to help promote safe, effective, and high quality medical devices that use artificial intelligence and machine learning. So it may be useful to consider these guiding principles if you are thinking of launching your device in the US, Canada, or the UK. In addition to this, as software, you generally have electronic IFUs. So these are IFUs that are embedded in the software themselves, or they can be like help boxes. And in this case, the electronic IFU regulation may also apply to your device. Next slide, please. So looking at some of the challenges that can come around with AI, you'd have automation bias. So this is where there's an over-reliance on the automated output from a clinical workflow. You can start to mitigate this by ensuring that the intended purpose of your device is clearly defined, and you're defining the boundary between what the software can do and where the clinician needs to provide input. And also ensuring that perhaps you're providing enough training so that people are not becoming over-reliant on what the software can do. And it's very important to also provide the limitations of the software. The next challenge that we can see is validation data of intended populations. This validation data needs to be representative of all intended populations. Generally, validated studies that tools are based on are often limited to quite small populations, and they're difficult to generalize. So you would either need to limit use of your software on the populations on which you have studied, or you'd have to ensure that you have enough of a sample to represent the full population that you're looking to use the device on. Black box issues, and this can occur when you are getting your software components off the shelf, and this can cause issues if you do not specifically know how the AI does what it does. So if there was ever to be an adverse incident and you couldn't identify the algorithms or how the product has come to the conclusion that it has, there may be some trouble there. So this can be resolved again by having requirements or an audit trail with a minimum level of detail that describes the decision process, and that can help address black box issues. Regulatory compliance, as we can see, you need to plan and ensure that any future regulations, for example, the AI regulations, are complied with, and you need to ensure that compliance is, you are complying in good time to avoid having to take your device off the market or have a gap in supply of your device. Last but not least is ethical challenges. So sometimes patient autonomy may be affected. So here we just need to ensure that informed consent is obtained before any treatment, or use it when you're using device for diagnosis. And you also could potentially think about providing information to patients on how the diagnosis or treatment is being determined by the AI. Privacy and confidentiality is another concern. However, there are things already like the GDPR which are in place to start to help address these issues. There's also a concern about boundary between physician and machine. So in this case, your intended purpose and the use of the device needs to be defined. And also you need to be providing sufficient training to physicians to define responsibilities when using AIs. And you need to be very clear about the limitations of AI. So those are just a few of the challenges that could affect putting out software as a medical device into the healthcare field. So as we can see, there are many benefits of trying to incorporate AI into your processes, be that for CTR, MDR, and IVDR. And again, there is a lot of movement in the industry, in the medical device industry at least, where they're using a lot of AI tools to help quicken and also make clinical decisions a lot faster, treatment a lot more efficient, and also diagnostic tools have become faster and more efficient. However, the software does not come without challenges. But I think that's the end of my presentation. So we would like to thank you for listening, and we take any questions.
Thank you both. That was a really, really good overview of all things you need to know relating to regulatory and AI application, both in clinical trial development, but also in medical devices. I can't see questions in the chat box. So if letting people thinking about it, I just have a very general one. It's obviously a big trend. With your experience of working with clients, what sort of rough percentage project coming to you with an AI component it is representing now? Do you have an idea?
Yeah, I think I couldn't give you a percentage, but I'd probably say at least 80% of new devices have some form of AI being used. Whereas,
Wow.
I mean, you get a lot of older devices which are just very generic, like hardware, basically. But there is a large number of devices that have AI enabled. I wouldn't say it's as much as 80%, to be honest. It's probably about 50%.
That's just to have an idea. But I think what that means is that most of devices now have a data component, and when the data component comes in play, this is where you would have putting an AI element to it. So that's interesting. Yeah. And is it the same with clinical trials in general terms? So both for medical devices or therapeutics, do you see really more coming in with an AI component?
I'll let Thea take that question.
I would say, well, because what we generally consult on are like pharmaceutical drugs and stuff, there's probably less AI involved, and it would be more just in the background to help submissions and stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, it might be more for medical devices.
Thanks. But clearly there is potential. It's just
yeah, definitely.
Maybe lacking, but I can see potential for helping the process as you described, but also to help with just patient data collection. That's an amazing tool. And it's good to know that people like you are helping, working on the regulatory front and making sure that's compliant. So if there's no further question from the audience, I think we're gonna call it a close. Big thank you for listening. Big thank you for putting this really, really good presentation together. As I mentioned, it is recorded, so that will be available on the Genesis app from next week after the Genesis week is finished. And obviously that's for review it or to share with any colleagues you think that would be beneficial for. In terms of Genesis, there are 2 more innovation workshops coming this afternoon. So if you want to look at them, they are listed on the app. Obviously, big day is tomorrow for those who are attending in person. And there is also some on-demand content you may be interested in watching, including member showcase, biotech, rising stars to see early stage companies, but also really good discussions on how biotech contributes to supporting and bringing solution to the big global challenge we're facing at the moment. So I think that's it on my end. So thanks very much again. And I hope to see you either online or face-to-face tomorrow. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.